This afternoon we're going to be talking about two subjects, both of which we have talked about in the past. One of which is personal to myself because I was in the process of declaring myself to be a state citizen rather than a U.S. citizen. So I would like to share with the viewers and the class members a few things that are absolutely certain, a number of things that are probable but not certain, and why I have in this particular situation decided for this year to file my personal income taxes. And everyone in the room knew that I was contemplating declaring myself a state citizen and therefore exempt from the unapportioned taxes that are imposed on 14th Amendment United States citizens. The few things that are perfectly clear. On a personal note, first, the registered mail that I sent to Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin and the letter that I sent to the Commissioner, almost said Commissar, Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, the notifications of receipt have not arrived back. Since I mailed about 5 items of mail and the other certificates of receipt I have no doubt whatsoever that the Secretary of State and the Commissioner of the IRS are withholding confirmation of receipt. In addition, I found out by chatting with some people who have been through this process that at least on some occasions, people who have gone through this process and successfully extricated themselves from 14th Amendment citizenship have been muzzled. They have successfully disengaged themselves from 14th Amendment citizenship, but in the process, they've been given a muzzling order. Now, the exact nature of the muzzling order, I'm not sure, but they have been forbidden to speak about their experience. For me personally, the ability to speak about the injustice is more important than what money I might save from not paying the income tax. Another feature is that one person who did not pay her income taxes, she was a former IRS enforcer, and for 4 years she did not pay her income taxes, but she made an additional crucial mistake. Her family name is Jackson, and I think it's Shirley Peel Jackson. But her political mistake was that she became an activist, and she gave talks about how to avoid paying income tax. So the powers that be let her accumulate 4 years of not paying her income tax, and then they arrested her, charged her, and she went before not a jury of her peers, but a jury of people who had been paying their income tax, who knew absolutely nothing about jury nullification. And she gave a very eloquent speech to this jury, but she was still acquitted, and she's serving 4 years, 4 one-year terms consecutively. Now, this was not justice, this was not enforcement of the law. To have 4 consecutive terms was sheer vindictiveness. So it doesn't surprise me that the IRS is capable of being vindictive, and they use a variety of techniques. For example, the tax court is an Article 1 tax court. That is, it is governed by the rules laid down by Congress rather than Article 3 court, which is compelled to follow common law and now elements of statutory law. The basic point is that the tax court is managed by the very entity, that is the United States government, which the tax avoider is combating. So you have the referee and the other person in the ring working together against the tax avoider. Now, among the things that are certain about the law is that the United States government cannot enslave you unless you are convicted of a crime. And the unapportioned income tax is a form of slavery. And the way they get around that is you have volunteered to pay that tax. Now, you never knew you were volunteering, and I never knew I was volunteering, but you were volunteering. When you applied for a Social Security card and number, you were volunteering to be a 14th Amendment United States citizen. I am told nowadays that little infants are volunteering to be United States citizens, the 14th Amendment United States citizens, because they are being issued their Social Security card as infants. This is known as a colorable contract. A colorable contract binds the contractee, the person who is bound by the contract, to a number of conditions that he or she never knew they were accepting. Now, this is not the only thing that is colorable about the contract. The contract, when it involves money, that money is a colorable form of money, because the Federal Reserve note in your wallet is colorable money. It looks like money, but it does not have all the qualities of money. Real money, among being a medium of exchange and a measure of value, is intrinsically valuable. Gold or silver or land or whatever. True money, by definition, has intrinsic value. And the paper in my wallet has no intrinsic value. So right now, the vast majority of Americans are victims hyphen contractees in a host of colorable contracts. However, getting the courts to excuse you from those colorable contracts is the major issue. And you have the tax court, the federal courts, and by extension, because every state in the union has agreed to use Federal Reserve notes as money, every state government is in some way or another beholden to the federal government of the municipality of the District of Columbia. So there are a number of things that are legal, but getting the courts to enforce that lawfulness is the major problem now. Since my wife is legitimately worried about the Internal Revenue Service, until I have a whole lot more evidence of the ways of challenging not the right, but the power of the Internal Revenue Service, I'll continue being a serf to the Internal Revenue Service. But unlike a lot of American citizens, I know I'm a serf. Now, that's really, are there any questions about that? Because I genuinely invite questions.
Where did you find this new information? You said you talked to some people, or you read it on the internet?
No, I both talking and reading on the internet. And I'm glad you asked the question because it stimulated my thinking. I also want to share with the participants here that there are a host of people talking about either sovereign citizens or the freedom movement or a host of terms like this. And the points I want to make is never call yourself a sovereign citizen if you're talking to a police officer, even though you might consider yourself one, for two reasons. The words sovereign and citizen are intrinsically contradictory, because a citizen is a servant of the government and a sovereign is superior to the government. But much more, in practical terms, much more important than that is that the enforcement agencies of the United States have been taught to think of sovereign citizens as domestic terrorists.
Oh.
Now, no one in this room is anything like a terrorist, myself included, but that doesn't matter if the law enforcement thinks of you as a terrorist. Catherine?
Who muzzled people who were successful, and how did they muzzle them?
I don't know the answers to those questions yet. And when I learn them, I will share them. That they have been muzzled, I know how exactly. Now, even getting that much information requires a certain amount of kabuki theater, because the people who have been muzzled aren't allowed to even talk about their being muzzled. So the people who know enough to ask questions cannot get answers because of the muzzling. Okay? The best that they can do is give nonverbal answers like, and frankly, if they're caught on film giving nonverbal answers, I bet they will have violated whatever conditions of immunity that they have agreed to. So look at it this way. A CIA agent who retires is still bound by his oath of confidentiality. The people who have achieved independence have presumably made some kind of, have been made aware of other ways the law can be applied to them. They can't be punished for telling the truth, but they can be punished for violating some intrinsic oath that they gave in the process. As I say, the truth of state citizenship being immune from the IRS, that's a matter of the Constitution. But getting the courts to accept the lawfulness of that set of facts requires a better lawyer than I am yet. That it has clearly been accomplished. But there is a reason that all of the citizens, all of the people who have contracted with weissparis.com, there's a reason they're all silent.
And your thing about certified mail makes one believe that the IRS would be opening the mail and looking at it before they sign the return receipt. I assume you sent it certified return receipt and you did not get the return receipt?
That's correct.
So that's where they're curious. I mean, did you send it to a P.O. box or to an address?
An address. And in the case of I sent it to Mr. Mnuchin and to Mr. Reddick.
Okay.
Yeah. There are enough dots to have a fairly good idea as to where the line goes. I'm sure Peggy is substantially relieved. And
You probably had a hard week.
Well, I had to give up the somewhat egotistical point of having a victory over the dragon, but my ego's taken much worse hits than that. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to stop studying. Okay, no further questions. I have a video to share with you, and it is a video, one of the best elaborations of what is and is not the climate debate that you will find. The guy is a fairly decent presenter, a fairly decent scientist.
Thank you very much. I hardly recognize myself with these introductions. The reason I'm doing this talk, because climate is not my day job. My day job is asteroids and meteorites and comets. But what I did as an undergraduate, because I went through and had a normal college career, and then in my 30s, I had an early midlife crisis and went totally bonkers and decided to go back to school and become a scientist. And so I had to start all over again, because I went into the graduate advisor at the University of Washington and said, I want to go to graduate school in geology. And he said, well, have you ever taken a geology course? I said, well, no, you don't need one for economics, silly guy. But I know this is what I want to do. And that's another story as to how I arrived at that. But I went back in my early 30s. And as an undergraduate, I needed to eat. And so I got a job in the stable isotope lab at the University of Washington. And this was you know, I've been a scientist for a long time since, and I have never been in like such an elaborate central casting science lab as I walked into that day when I applied for a job, because it was a room about twice the size of this room. And it was covered floor to ceiling on all the walls and down the center with glass tubing and beakers and Bunsen burners and stuff bubbling over. And big machines with lots of flashing lights. It was a science lab from central casting. And what they did was, amongst other things, they measured the isotopic ratios of ice cores, and that's what I did for 3 years. And for 3 hours a day, 3 days a week, I would stand in a freezer and cut up ice cores, and then go measure them in a mass spectrometer. You know, and here I was, you know, middle-aged undergraduate, no experience in science, and I said, I want a job running a mass spectrometer. And for some reason, they let me do it. And so a lot of the data I'm going to show you today, I actually took, which is kind of cool, because I attend scientific meetings later, and years later, I was sitting in a meeting, and some of the data I took flashed up on the screen. And in the question and answer period, somebody got up and said, I don't believe that data. It looked like they made a bunch of mistakes. And so I got up right behind them, and I said, I took that data. And we noticed the trends that you noticed, because we're not idiots. But we checked it over 3 times, and that's reality. Just because you can't figure out reality, that's not reality's problem. That's your problem. And I'll be happy to discuss this with you outside. I believe in kind of a muscular science. I've always wanted to do that. Anyway, so I'm going to show you a bunch of stuff. The problem is, with climate, there's a lot of things going on. This is not soundbite science. So I'm going to tell you a lot of complicated stuff. I'll try to be entertaining. Some of it will be boring. I apologize in advance. But with climate, you hear a lot of stuff. You see greenhouse gases are warming the globe. Sunspots actually cause the warming. These are actually the sunspots from Tuesday. There's a NOAA site that you can go to and get the latest sunspot data. That's the latest sunspot data. That we're in ice age. That the glaciers are melting. Sea level is rising. CO2 is natural. CO2 was a lot higher in the past. CO2 was a lot lower in the past. That the Earth is a lot warmer in the past. The Earth was a lot colder in the past. And the problem is that everything here is true. Sound confusing? Well, no, it's not. Actually, it's quite reasonable. The thing is, we actually know quite a bit about past climates. This is what I did in this laboratory. Now, I can go into excruciating, mind-numbing detail as to how we know it and the physics behind it. I will spare you that. If you insist, I will tell you. Okay. But what this does is it tells us we know the Earth's climate history pretty damn well for the last 500 million years. After that it gets a little tricky, but for the last 500 million years, and that's not bad. And so we can actually look at what's normal for Earth. And the question is, what is normal for Earth? Is today's climate normal for Earth?
Yeah. I want to point out, if he's talking about data for the last 500 million years, he's talking about 500 million years, which is roughly, very roughly, 10% of the history of the Earth per se. Humans have been on the Earth somewhere in the vicinity of 1 to 3 million years. So we're talking about human beings are a small fraction of the most recent period of Earth's history, and he's going to be talking about climate variation in the last 500 million years. We've been around for something like less than 1% of that.
Now actually I like this picture because this is the same location. There's about 60 years difference here. You can see the bathtub ring left by the glacier right there. See, right there. So, also, what I'm talking about is climate. And climate is easy. I read climate out of the geologic record. Predicting weather is actually tough. That's way beyond my abilities because that is hard. You know, there's a reason why people don't forecast hurricane tracks more than 5 days in advance, because that's really, really hard. I don't do weather. I do climate. And when I talk about climate, I talk about long-term climate. Climate in geologic terms. And in geologic terms, you can actually find out the effects, because this climate experiment has been done over and over again in Earth history. And all you have to do is go back and read the rocks. And that's what I do. Addressing the question, what is normal, all you need to do is go back and look at the geologic record. And how things change with changes in the various climate parameters, all you have to do is go back and you can read the past climates from the rocks and the chemistry laid down in those periods. And the nice thing is that people that are a lot smarter than I have puzzled this out. And have a lot higher tolerance for boredom. And so they've done this over the last 500 million years. And we know this pretty well. About as well, remember, science is tentative. Science, we're always groping for answers and testing these answers. So, we know that, so there are various grades of how well you know things. This is a pretty high grade. We know this pretty well. And so what's normal for climate? This is Phanerozoic. Phanerozoic is what you live in today. That's the period when you have like complex critters. We are here at 0 in the Neogene. Go back a 500 million years. And the first thing you see is that it is about as cold right now as it has ever been in the last 500 million years. We are actually in an extraordinarily cold period. We are in an ice age today. We're in a relatively warm period of an extremely cold period.
I'm interrupting at this point just to point out, you see the line that is identified as cold on the far left lower portion? The dinosaurs disappeared slightly to the right of that line. Where it says 50, we're about where the blue line ends on the right-hand part of the blue bar. The very first blue bar on the left, that's about where the dinosaurs disappeared. I want you to have an appreciation of the scope of his graph.
I didn't say this was going to be easy. This is, reality is just, I'm not going to sugarcoat reality. This is reality. And so we were very cold. Back during the Cretaceous, the K means Cretaceous, scientists don't spell well. It was extremely hot. But average for Earth is a lot hotter than it is today. But what you should take away from this slide is that there's nothing normal about climate. Climate varies a lot. And it varies a lot for very good reasons, which we can figure out, and which we will figure out tonight. But what were things like in the Cretaceous? Cretaceous with a C. Back in the mid-Cretaceous, this is the temperature profile by latitude. We are about right there, about 30 degrees. So actually, the climate for the latitude of Pensacola was not all that much different in the Cretaceous than it is right now. It's pretty warm. Not unbearably warm, because with a little bit of air conditioning, it's very pleasant to live in Pensacola. But it's much different than the present day. And the difference is not in the low latitudes, it's in the high latitudes. Because in the Cretaceous, nowhere on Earth, even at the poles, was it on average below freezing, if you can imagine that. In the Cretaceous, you had a temperature profile that essentially made what you consider temperate climates going all the way to the Arctic Circle. So in the Cretaceous, you had warm adapted vegetation and warm adapted critters at the Arctic Circle. You can go to the Arctic Circle today in Canada and find breadfruit tree fossils, fossils of turtles and crocodiles. And there was no continental glaciation anywhere, not even the poles, not in Antarctica. You had tropical conditions to 40 degrees north-south latitude. So that's the same latitude as New York. Can you imagine the climate of Key West in New York City? Coral reefs growing off of Long Island. No hard freezes in Ohio. Can you imagine Ohio without hard freezes? People would want to live there all year round. I can say this about Ohio because I've lived there. I don't want to insult Ohio. Ohio is a wonderful place to live. But they have hard winters. You would have essentially the climate that you enjoy in Pensacola in Ohio. Why so much warmer? Well, back then, CO2 was about 1,700 parts per million. Now, this doesn't mean a thing to you right now. You will know these numbers at the end of this lecture in great detail, because I will keep repeating them to you. That's 6 times the pre-industrial levels of CO2 that we enjoy in the recent period. And remember, when I talk about recent, I'm talking as a geologist. So this is over geologic time. I consider the recent period the last 10,000 years. This is just my quirk. So when I talk about the old days, the old days are, 70 million years ago. The other quirk is that I'm not interested in things, scientifically, I just don't have interest in things that haven't been dead for 500 million years or so. But no, that's another story. Anyway, so why so much much higher CO2, a much different ocean circulation in continental locations, but there was a downside to all of this. So basically, this would be, in the Cretaceous versus now, this would be the same location. This kind of vegetation, which today it looks like that. The downside, of course, is that no continental glaciation means a much higher sea level, something like 150 to 200 meters higher sea level. So the downside is that St. Louis is a seaport. There is no Florida above the waves. All of Florida is a part of a shallow sea. Almost all the coastal areas are inundated. All the Middle East is mostly underwater. So there are good parts and bad parts, like anything else. So it's much warmer. You can live in Ohio quite pleasantly, except you just don't get to live in Florida. Now you ask, well, is that normal? Well, what is normal sea level? We are here at 0. If any of you work in the oil industry, you might recognize what is called a Vail curve. This came out of the oil industry after spending literally billions of dollars of research, because this is how you find oil. The way you get oil is what geologists call a succession of transgressions and regressions of sea level, which trap the right sort of critters and right sort of sediment underneath the right sort of layers of stuff in order to make oil. And that's very much a function of sea level. So this is actually pretty damn good data. And because, you make billions and billions of dollars if it's exact. So that's a good reason. It's not just because, hey, you get tenure or something. You make vast amounts of money. And they fire you if you screw up. Yeah, so, and also, you see the spikiness here? That's actually real. Sea level is actually highly variable, and not just from melting glaciers. It turns out that the mid-ocean ridges, where most of the volcanism occurs, this plate tectonic stuff, the plates actually move around, they actually vary quite a bit. And when when the mid-ocean ridges decide to crank up and expand and create plate faster, they actually expand. If they expand, there's no other place for the water to go except into your homes and gardens. So, and this occurs on, this is geologic time again, so it occurs on like million-year time scale. So, don't go out and sell your waterfront property. But, you have to recognize that this is the sort of thing that happens. So let's talk about the recent climate. And the recent climate is like the last 50 million years or so. Back in the Eocene, it was pretty warm. And then what's been happening over the last 50 million years is a slow deterioration, but steady deterioration of the climate. You actually didn't get Antarctic glaciation until about 35 million years ago. And then it glaciated and thawed out and reglaciated. And since it's been reglaciated over the last about 12 million years, there's been this very steady, very sharp drop in the average temperature of the globe. Why is this happening? Well, before I go into that, I just want to say that if you just look at the last 5 million years, this trend has continued and it's been very steady. And what happens is that it's climaxed in a series of glaciations. In the last million years, these glaciations have greatly intensified. And so you're getting bigger swings in climate as it gets colder. And so what we're living in is a relatively warm period of what is an incredibly cold period in Earth history. So this is the last 400,000 years, and I actually took some of this data. We're here, and what you find is for the last 400,000 years, there have only been 4 periods when it was this warm. And these periods usually last 3,000 or 4,000 years. Does that make you worried? It made me worried when I took this data. It's okay, though. I'll show you why. But anyway, we're here, and we're actually in the most extraordinary long interglacial. The warm periods are called interglacials. And these things are typical. The glacial periods are characterized by this stepwise deterioration in climate down to a glacial maximum. Now, what are glacial maximums like? The last glacial maximum was 18,000 years ago. Last glacial maximum, you had a mile-thick glacier, mile-thick ice in New York City, Berlin, and London. You had a mile of ice over Seattle. You had continuous sea ice down to Cape Hatteras in the winter. Can you imagine your condo in Cape Hatteras in the winter with continuous sea ice? Continuous sea ice down to Baja California. Well, I've been to Baja California. I've gone in the ocean there. It's cold. I can see why it would have sea ice there, but still, that is kind of extreme. But we have excellent geologic evidence that that's what happened. And you had continuous summer sea ice all the way along the continents. How do we know this? Well, once again, you can go look at you can read this out of the geologic record. You can look for what are called geologic striations. And don't believe me. Go and look for yourself. This particular location is the bedrock in Central Park, and you can see grooves cut in it from the rocks dragged on the bottom of the glacier. You can figure out how thick and what direction the glacier was moving from the depth of the grooves. This particular one is across the street from the American Museum of Natural History. As you go through the Iron Gate, turn to the right. Go and look for yourself. Same thing with the crocodile, turtle, and breadfruit fossils in the Canadian Arctic. You can go to these fossil locations and you can look for yourself. I urge you to do that. Watch out for the polar bears. So what caused the Ice Age? Well, blame China and India. Seriously. What's happened is that we actually live in an extraordinary, I keep saying this, we live in an extraordinary time in Earth history, but we do. Very few times in Earth history are you able to walk to the bottom of the stratosphere on a mountain. But you can do that in the Himalayas. That is a very rare event. You think because you can do it today that it must be normal for Earth. But no, that's very abnormal. You look back in the geologic record and you don't get 30,000 foot tall mountains very often. This is really unusual. And what happened is, over the last 20 or 30 million years, India collided with China and created the Tibetan Plateau, an extraordinarily high set of mountains. That really, when you raise stuff up like that and you break up rock like that, what you do is you vastly increase rock weathering. Now, I can go into excruciating detail again on the chemistry of rock weathering, but the bottom line is that it sucks carbon out of the atmosphere like crazy. And that's what happened here. We've lost about 80% of the carbon that was in the Cretaceous atmosphere due to the Himalayan rock weathering. So you can blame China and India. And what happened was, this has basically made the climate vulnerable to small changes in solar energy inputs. Now, and these small changes are caused by orbital variations. The orbital variations are always there. But since you don't have as much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, it makes it more difficult to distribute heat across the planet. And if you don't have the greenhouse gases, you're not going to distribute the heat into the polar regions. And if you drop the solar input to the polar regions, you're going to end up getting glaciers. And so what happens is that the glaciers are triggered by variations in the Earth's orbit. The way this works is, blame Kepler and Galileo and Copernicus. The Earth's orbit is not a perfect circle. You actually are closer to the sun by about 5 million kilometers in the middle of winter, January 3rd. Did anybody celebrate perihelion? No.
But we will next year.
Now, next year you can celebrate perihelion. And it's really easy to remember. Aphelion is July 4th. Everybody celebrates aphelion. Nobody celebrates perihelion. I could never understand that. But you get 6% less solar energy at aphelion. And aphelion happens to be in the summer. So this actually moves around in the orbit and in the seasons. It's called precession. And so right now, summers are a little bit cooler and warmer, and winters are a little bit warmer because of the positions in orbits. But that changes over time. And it can be a fair amount. 6% of solar energy is a fair amount. This is basically a simple idea. If you have warm winters, you're going to melt all the snow that falls in your really cold. Or if you have warm summers, you melt all the snow that falls in your really cold winters. If you have cold summers, that can allow snow to accumulate in the right latitude range. And also, warmer winters tend to produce more snow. And I think we're starting to experience, last year was a good example of that in the Northeast, where it was relatively warm, but it was really, really snowy. The guy who puzzled this all out was a Serbian mathematics professor called Milankovitch. And there's a Serbian graduate student in our group, and she just despairs of my pronunciation. So I apologize in advance that I mispronounced his name. But this was back in the early days of the 20th century. This was big science. The question of why there were ice ages. Because you could see abundant geologic evidence that there were at least 4 big ice ages, 4 big glaciations in Europe and North America. And the burning question was why? And this guy decided that the way to figure this out was to look at variations in the solar flux at high latitudes. And you can vary that solar flux at 65 degrees north latitude by as much as 25%. But the way to prove this was that you had to do a bunch of spherical trig and figure this out over the last 250,000 years. Now, a smart student with an Excel spreadsheet can do this in about 2 weeks. Back then, in the old days, astronomical computer was not a machine, it was a job description. If you wanted to figure out where to point your telescope, you needed somebody to puzzle this out. And so astronomical computers were the people that actually that told the fat bearded white guy who was the astronomer. I can say this being a fat bearded white guy myself, and also astronomer, where to do this. And typically the staffs were lots of really smart women who graduated from Ivy League colleges and prestigious women's colleges like Holyoke and Bryn Mawr, who couldn't get jobs anyplace else. And these guys actually did a lot of the fundamental astronomy in the 19th and 20th century and didn't get any credit for it. Because of course this guy wouldn't put any of these names on his papers. A major injustice. Being a fat bearded white astronomer, I apologize for that. But that's the way it was. The way you figure this out was somebody actually sat down and did the math by hand with a pencil. And that's what Milankovitch did. In 1910, he started working on this. And he figured that if his day job was teaching mathematics at the University of Belgrade. And he figured that when he came home and had dinner and then worked for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, and took all Saturday and worked 10 hours a day, and then Sunday he would go to church and hang out with his family. If he did that, he could do all the necessary calculations in only 22 years. This was science back in the old days. No Excel spreadsheets. He was lucky and unlucky at the same time, because what happened was that World War I hit in 1914. He was a reserve officer in the Serbian army. He went into the army. In 1915, he was captured by the Austrians, thrown into prison camp. And he had a buddy in the Hungarian Academy of Sciences who bailed him out of prison camp. And this is a different age. I was an Air Force officer, so I think this is really cool. Back in those days, if you were an officer, you could give your word, your parole, and they would let you out of prison camp, and you would promise not to, raise your hand and promise not to fight anymore. And then they would let you out of prison camp, and you could go off and do your own thing. What a civilized concept. And so what they did was they paroled him to the reading room of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest for the rest of World War I. And so he was able to work on his stuff 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. And he actually got years and years of work done during that period. And he went back and he actually was able to publish in 1925. And what he found was that if you look at these cycles, that the orbit of the Earth's orbit actually affects the amount of sunlight you get tremendously, because there's an eccentricity cycle that goes from about 0 to 6 degrees in the roundness of the orbit. There's a tilt cycle that goes from about 24 to 21.5 degrees, and an index of precision, that where you are in the orbit when you're closest and farthest from the sun. And you can combine all these effects and actually see how much sunlight you get at high latitudes. And it turns out that just lines up with the relative cold and hot in the climate. This is more of the data that I took. And so there's the 100,000 year, this is hot, this is cold, this is right now, this is roughly 100,000 years ago. That's the previous interglacial. This is the eccentricity cycle, 100,000 years. There's the precession cycle, 23,000 years. That's the tilt cycle, 41,000 years. It lines up. These orbital changes absolutely dominated our climate for the last 500,000 years. And all the other things that you hear about in climate, El Niños, Pacific oscillations, Atlantic decadal oscillations, all these are in the noise. All of that is subsumed in the thickness of the lines you see here, because this absolutely dominates. This is what creates a mile-thick glacier on top of New York City. And just because it's a little rainier because of El Nino, that's in the noise compared to having a mile-thick glacier on top of your apartment. Okay? So that's where we are. So our climate for the last million years has been characterized by these long periods of terrible glacial conditions. Glacial conditions like, tundra in southern France. You can go to southern France. I did this last year, and go and see cave paintings where they have cave paintings of herds of reindeer, because that was the scene. Now it's bikini-clad women on the beach, not reindeer anymore. All that is driven by orbital changes. So the nice thing is, though, that you can calculate how these orbits are going to affect climates, because this is what absolutely has dominated our climate for the last 500,000 years. And we should be able to figure out what the climate should be doing given the solar input. And 10,000 years ago, it was really warm. This is the line you need to look at here, because this is summer insolation, the amount of sunlight you're getting at 65 degrees north. And it peaked about 10,000 years ago, and then has been in decline ever since. So what should be happening is we should be dropping into the next ice age. Climate should be deteriorating. Things should be getting colder, given the solar input. The problem is that it hasn't been. Solar input is dropping, but the ice is melting. So what's going on? And what's going on is us and greenhouse gases, CO2 and methane. What happened is that our ancestors were smart kids. Up until about 8,000 years ago, the atmosphere stuck with historic trends. But about 8,000 years ago, our ancestors invented agriculture, started clearing forests. When you clear a forest, what you do is it's slash and burn. You put lots of carbon back in the atmosphere. You control the forests with fire. Very intensive, very carbon-intensive sorts of agriculture. Methane the same way. About 5,000 years ago, they invented rice cultivation and domesticated livestock. Nothing is a better methane producer than a herd of beef cattle. You can also test this for yourself. Go to a cattle ranch. Let me know what you think. The other thing is rice cultivation. I don't know how many of you spend time in rice paddies, but rice is a swamp grass. And so what you need are swamps in order to grow rice. When you don't have swamps, you go create them. And and one of the tests here is that you can sort of cruise around the Far East on Google Earth just to see how extensive the rice cultivation is. Prove for yourself. These terraces are 3,000 years old in the Philippines. Basically, once you use up the swampy terrain, you got to start terracing or you starve. And terracing dates back about 5,000 years. The limiting factor here is water. If you have a source of water, you can make terraces. I really like this picture because essentially it looks like a topo map, but it's not. It's just, this was a book I found in the library. It was done by Claire Chenault's photo reconnaissance officer during the World War II period. Worked for the Flying Tigers. And so he has all these great pictures of China the way it used to be. These days they run superhighways through this, but essentially everything that could be terraced was terraced. And so human input to the atmosphere started a long time ago. It's not just us in the industrial age. Basically, in the pre-industrial age, you started out with about 260 parts per million CO2. And human activity stopped the decline of CO2 and methane in the atmosphere and cranked it up to about 280 parts per million, essentially putting carbon, gigatons, billions of tons, a gigaton is a billion tons, of carbon into the atmosphere. So about 80 gigatons of carbon. That's equivalent to about 10% of the biomass. But that's about right for the forest clearing that happened in the pre-industrial age. The problem is that your solar input is still dropping. And so even though you're tossing in more carbon from burning more forests and domesticating more livestock and making more rice paddies, there's a point of diminishing returns. And so actually things started to get colder back in the Middle Ages, simply because you couldn't keep up. What we did then was we tapped a new reservoir. We figured out how to get into fossil fuels and use those. The whole pre-industrial atmosphere had about 600 gigatons of carbon in it. What we do now is we add about 9 gigatons a year from almost all from fossil fuels. There's a tiny little bit. This is cement production right here. All the rest of this is fossil fuels. People say, well, what about volcanoes? On average, the entire volcanic input into the atmosphere is 0.2 of a gigaton of carbon per year. People say, well, what about Mount Pinatubo? This is Mount Pinatubo. Notice the guy with the water buffalo plowing, who's ignoring the largest eruption in the last 150 years. That's Clark Field in the background. Since this is a flyer town, probably a few of you flown into Clark Field. Clark Field was a little bit the worse for wear after this. But anyway, the Mount Pinatubo eruption, they're not really sure, but this is in the noise. 0.08 gigatons of carbon is the maximum estimate. That's in the noise. The biggest natural input, net input to the atmosphere is volcanism. And that's 45 times lower than the human input from fossil fuels every year. 45 times. So, now remember, I've been talking thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of years. And these are big trends. So let's talk about the noise, because you and I live in the noise. I've been talking about geologic scales. You and I live at human scales. And so year-to-year variation, or decadal variation, means a lot. Within the big trends, there are a lot of short-term effects. Things like sunspots, Pacific decadal oscillation, southern oscillation, volcanic eruptions, all sorts of other things too. And all of these have an effect on short-term climate, because this spikiness is real. That's the noise that I said that was the noise I was talking about in these big swings. But remember, when we're talking about big swings, this is the swing down into the ice age. It goes about another 6 degrees down here. So that's what I'm talking about with the big glacial swings. So we live up here in the spiky area. Let's pretend, and I don't like to do climate modeling because that's really complicated. I like this model because it's fairly simple. And I'll just show you this to show that it's possible to explain short-term variation. Let's pretend that short-term climate is driven by 4 things. The sunspot cycle, because sunspots do affect solar irradiance and the amount of watts per square meter that the sun dumps on the Earth. So you get an 11-year cycle where you get a little more irradiance and a little less. And it affects it on the order of less than 1/10 of a degree C, like 1/2 of a degree C. Then you get volcanic aerosols. Mount Pinatubo blew up and threw a lot of gunk into the upper atmosphere. And that actually cooled things down quite a bit. That's Mount Pinatubo right there. And then you get the El Nino southern oscillation. El Nino actually does change the energy balance because it's a big lump of warm water that sloshes around the Pacific in the simplest sense. And once again, we can do this more complicated. But if you sum all of these things and say that's what drives the short-term climate with this anthropogenic influence, that is, dumping more carbon in the atmosphere, you can actually model. The black line is the instrumental surface temperature record, or as I like to call it, reality. You can actually model reality pretty damn well. Not bad, though. Fit is 87. The thing is, though, that we're just coming out of a very low sunspot cycle. Actually, in the last 50 or 60 years, a historically low sunspot cycle. So things were actually slightly cooler because of low sunspots. But we're going into solar maximum right now. So sunspot cycle is cranking up. As a result, what's going to happen, I will predict, is for the next 4 or 5 years, you're going to have a succession of extremely hot years. Sad but true. And so far, it's proven, the average temperature records have been proven that that's what's happening. So, of course, people can say, well, is the temperature record wrong? Well, it could be. But it turns out that you don't have to rely on instrumental records. You can do things like you can measure temperatures directly from boreholes, because there's actually a temperature record that's preserved in the shallow crust. All of these show strong warming in the last 100 years. You can look at the average monthly sea ice extent. This is updated to this year, and it's declining. You can look at Alaska growing seasons. They're getting progressively longer. You can look at low elevation glaciers in Alaska. The one I showed you was Muir Glacier. That's not the only one, McCarty Glacier. I love these guys because what they did was that they went through and got a whole bunch of old National Geographic style pictures of glaciers in lowland Alaska, and then went to the exact same place and took another picture. I love this. And I've got a big collection of them. I'll bore you with a few of them because I just love these things. Northwest Glacier really got hammered. There it is, way back up there. Point is that you can look at a glacial mass balance and it's just dropping off a cliff. Trends. I was born in 1950. When I first drew breath, the CO2 level was 310 parts per million. In this room today, it is about 390 parts per million. Back in 1950, we were putting out 1.3 gigatons per year. Today, we're putting out about 9 gigatons a year. You know, you just have to be in Los Angeles and look out at a crowded freeway and say, how can you believe that doesn't have an effect? Of course it has an effect. The other effect is, when I went to graduate school, I was in my mid-30s. And so when I walked into Brown University, I was the oldest graduate student at Brown University. I ended up sitting next to a guy who was the second oldest graduate student at Brown University. I was 35, he was 34. A guy named Wei Deng from People's Republic of China. I said, Wei, 34, that's pretty damn old for a Chinese graduate student. And he said, well, yeah, I went to graduate school back in the regular time, but then the Cultural Revolution hit and they sent me into exile in Tibet for 9 years. So, wow, that's a really good excuse. Then he looked at me and said, what's your excuse? It's like the 70s. I lived them, I don't remember them. But that was 1985. And the Chinese, which this is like a quarter to a third of the world's population, they did us this huge favor during most of my lifetime. This is a hugely populous, hugely talented, hugely smart, ambitious group of people who decided to make themselves just dirt grinding poor for decade after decade after decade. And they didn't compete with us for resources or anything. They just wanted to be poor because, that was their policy. And so this is the GDP of the People's Republic. And then unfortunately, Mao Zedong died. Mao Zedong was this huge favor for us, believe me, in terms of carbon dioxide. They decided, oh, well, why should we be poor anymore? Let's go make stuff and sell it and become rich. And boom, this one only goes to 2004. The actual GDP is 47,160 billion yuan. It's like above the second floor now on this plot. And all these guys want the same sort of thing we want. You know, they want to live a middle-class lifestyle. They want to drive a car. They want to have freeways. And they want to have power that works 24 hours a day so they can run their air conditioning. Because believe me, it's just as miserable in Shanghai as it is in Pensacola during the summer, because you guys are at the same latitude. And so they're producing a gigawatt-sized coal-fired power plant every 2 weeks in China. So what do you think that's going to do to the carbon input? Okay, so some answers. Yes, we're in an ice age. If you look back over the last 500 million years, continental glaciation is very unusual. Very unusual. Does the climate vary? Of course it varies. It varies constantly. Is the current climate normal? No, normal for Miami is to be under 80 meters of water. Normal is not to have a Florida. Is the planet warming because of human action? As a scientist, I am just floored that this is a political thing for political discussion. Of course it's warming. We are well into the next Milankovitch cycle. We should be getting advances in glaciation. And we're not, because we've been smart enough to, this is called geoengineering, we've been smart enough to change the atmospheric chemistry and redistribute the heat into the high northern latitudes and make up for this solar insulation that we're not getting. Human action over my lifetime has increased atmospheric CO2 by 25% and stopped the Milankovitch cycle in its tracks. But we have to recognize what we're doing. The downside of this is that if you look in Earth history and you have high levels of CO2, high levels of greenhouse gases, you don't have continental glaciation. If you don't have continental glaciation, you don't have Miami. So the bottom line here is, do you like sea level where it is? Yes or no? If you don't care, then we're done talking. You know, go and drive your Hummer. Now, as I tell my class, this is not my problem. I'm going to be dead before this is going to be a serious problem. This is my children's problem and their children's problem. You can expect sea level rise of between about 2.5 to 6.5 feet over the next by 2000, over the next 90 years. Most of that is going to be nonlinear, so most of it's going to occur toward the end of the century. The unknown here is the dynamics of glacial collapse. Now, luckily, in Greenland is kind of bowl-shaped, so most of the glaciers are surrounded by mountains, and there are only a few exits. And so it probably won't collapse really catastrophically. You can see things in the geologic past where you have catastrophic glacial collapse. The Laurentide ice sheet in Canada catastrophically collapsed and melted. If any of you have ever been to Quebec or Montreal, you can see the St. Lawrence Valley. And if you look at the St. Lawrence Valley, the St. Lawrence occupies this little tiny strip on this big, huge, flat plain of a valley. And you can see mountains off in the distance one way and mountains off in the distance the other. That whole thing used to be a solid river when the Laurentide ice sheet collapsed. And what happened was, over 1,000 years, you increased sea level by 30 meters. So you can get really rapid sea level increase. So do you like sea level? Because what's happened is that we've already gotten to a level where the Greenland ice sheet is in disequilibrium with the CO2 level in the atmosphere. It's going to melt. The question is how fast. And we're working on that. We don't know quite yet. But this is going to be a problem for future generations. My students then say, oh, thanks a lot. I said, well, hey, I'm just passing it along. My father left me the Cold War. His father left him World War II. That's what generations do. They didn't appreciate that, but what the hell. So anyway, just to give you a little bit of perspective, we are here. So, 1 meter is no big deal. 2 meters, not so good for the Keys. But then again, you can see why the Florida Chamber of Commerce hates this. Ask yourself what percentage of the assessed valuation of Florida is within 10 feet of sea level. So anyway, I will leave you with this happy thought. Thank you very much.
There are a number of interesting questions that I'm going to skip, but I want you to hear the very last questioner because he speaks from an unscientific point of view.
Yeah. Wow, wait for the microphone.
Loved your speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
Got a lot out of it. But I need to think this through. We can say this, but there is no proof that that's going to happen. We can go through the math. We can do all the scientific evidence we can. But show me the numbers. You showed numbers, and I appreciate that. I can make pretty graphs. I don't think that's going to happen.
Okay. That's fine with me. See, I don't do any mathematical modeling. What I do is I look at past epochs in Earth history where you've had elevated CO2. When you have elevated CO2, you have higher sea levels. And you can do the Milankovitch modeling fairly easily. And there's a number of sites that do that for you. So take a look at it yourself. As I say, in these past climate epochs, don't believe me, you can go and look at these things yourself. One of the things about scientists is we don't believe in theories. We observe them. And so we're always constantly testing them.
Let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.
In my opinion, one of the best tasks of integrating several different fields to tell us where human beings are interfering with the climate, what the time frame is for that interference, and admitting that the interference is taking place and recognizing that the time frame does not lend itself to hyperbole, but it does lend itself to intelligent assessment. Now, the Chinese, as an example, are investing heavily in thorium nuclear energy, because thorium nuclear energy is very low in terms of carbon production and will eliminate natural gas, coal, and oil burning electrical generation plants. Whether it will do it in order to keep Florida above water, I don't know. But it also tells me why the super wealthy are not particularly worried, because they're not living in areas that are going to be underwater. They might be vacationing in Miami. They might even be vacationing in New Orleans. But they will have the money to buy in the Rocky Mountains, or for that matter, perhaps in the Himalayas. So this is a significant problem. It's not being addressed because it is not a worry to the people who will be able to buy their way out of the problem. The professor's name is Britt, if I recall correctly, and this Britt, B-R-I-T-T. And if you go to YouTube, you can download it and see this video for yourself. Thank you very much.